Welcome back. As many of you know, in the last episode, we took a detour. I doubled back to re-record an introduction to this whole set of podcasts. My apologies to those of you who I confused. Some of you don't know what I'm talking about because you never saw the first introduction a year ago. But some of you reached out and said, wow, we're going back and we're going to restart at the beginning again. No, we're not going back to start at the beginning. I do hope one day to re-record episodes 1 through 42, make them better, tighter, add some episodes about the Greeks and the Romans and explain Western civilization and why it's important and back up 1,000 years and all that. But that's future work. We're not going backwards to pick that up. We are charging ahead. That means today is episode number 43, which has us back at the Reformation. And hopefully by now you understand that Luther's actions there at the Wittenberg Castle with the hammer and the 95 Theses set in motion a whole bunch of things. And his actions were sort of a catalyst. It was the proverbial last straw. It ignited a fire. The point is, the fire was ready to be ignited. Things were going to burn. In one sense, people will argue that Luther gets too much credit for the revolution that followed. Something was going to happen with or without him. So there are even some who go to great lengths to dismiss Luther altogether. They say he doesn't matter. I think they're crazy. So I have tried to be very clear. Luther was not a saint. He had some really rough edges. That shouldn't surprise us. Church history is full of very flawed people, as Dixon's comments, both bullies and saints. Church history is riddled with people who are a mixture of good and bad. And that shouldn't surprise us. The Bible is filled with a mixture of people who are deeply flawed. And thank God for this. It's very real. With the exception of Jesus, there are no purely good people in Scripture. He is the only hero. And so I think we can celebrate the fact that we have a very honest appraisal of what's going on. Now, just to sort of be completely clear here, there are some minor characters in the Bible about whom we know nothing bad. We just don't know much about them. So it's not that we're told they're all good. And Daniel emerges alongside of Jesus as somebody about whom we know a fair bit and we don't see anything bad. But the main players, so Abraham, Adam and Eve, Abraham, Moses, David, jump to the New Testament, Peter and Paul. These are people who are a mess. They're liars, cheaters, adulterers, cowards, and murderers. So it should not surprise us that the rest of church history is shaped by others just like them. To be sure, many of these people try hard to be good, to be faithful, to follow God. I hope you do as well. But they were broken and sinful just as we are. Well, the way some people tell the story, Luther is a mentally unbalanced man who does little good and who gets way too much credit for what happened. I want to guard against that. While admitting that he had issues and while acknowledging that something would have happened had he not been there, I want to note that he steered things in a particular direction and that this direction was good. Had he not come along, someone else would have lit the match that set everything ablaze. But who knows what might have happened next? Who knows how they might have steered this? I believe God raised up Luther for that moment. And that points to what I want to highlight in this episode, that is that ideas, people I guess as well, but ideas have consequences. Luther introduces, or as a Protestant I would say he reintroduces, some biblical ideas that end up redirecting society. They create a certain kind of culture, and this culture has a certain set of outcomes. I think I can say that, although I'm not sure. Today, many are arguing that all cultures are morally equivalent. I think that's a flawed idea. I think some cultures are better than other cultures in certain things. Some of the cultures that are good in some things, I think the Western culture to our point today, is relatively good at creating wealth, are not good at other things like friendship. So it's complicated, but as always, I'm getting out of my skis, so let me back up here. As we're moving into the second half of 100 plus, or at least approaching the halfway point, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about ideas and how they filter out and how over the course of generations they end up shaping cultures and shaping society, and how our particular culture, Western civilization, I guess I can't say our particular culture, but how Western civilization in particular is shaped, and then how we get into the modern moment. So, we're in the Reformation. We've had episodes 2 on Luther, 1 on Zwingli. We did something on the 5 solas. We did a couple on Calvin. I did something, a flyover the 16th century generally. We had one on the English Act of Supremacy, Henry VIII launching, sort of claiming to be the head of the church and steering it towards the Church of England. Today we're going to focus on the Protestant work ethic and how the Reformation concept of work ends up shaping Western culture. The idea is that among the many things that were shaped by the Reformation, and again, we've talked about the fact that it shapes politics, it shapes family, it shapes art, it shapes music. It's not just the church, it's not just theology, but among the many things that were changed during the Reformation, one of the things that was changed was an attitude about work, and the Protestant attitude about work has some particular consequences for the Western world down the line. So, what is the Protestant work ethic? Chances are you've heard this term before, and you might even remember enough to associate it with this German sociologist and political economist Max Weber. But I'm guessing that is perhaps as far as it goes. Well, in 1905, Max Weber wrote a book. It was actually initially sort of trickles out as a series of articles and essays. Eventually it becomes something called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And in this, he claims that capitalism emerged in Europe when Protestants, in particular Calvinists, influenced large groups of people to do a few things. First of all, to change their view of work. In light of passages like Ecclesiastes 9, 10, and Colossians 3:23, and some others that talk about work being good, the Exodus 20, the fourth commandment that says, we think of it as being about a day of rest, but it actually leads by saying, on 6 days you will work. So Luther is going to celebrate work and say, we do our work unto the Lord. Work has value. All work has value. This is going to include even secular work. So he's going to argue that it's not just the work that is done by the priest that matters, but the farmer and the cobbler and all the other people doing all kinds of other things. It's all God's world that this is going to change things. Additionally, that at this time, given what Luther is saying, there's going to be a push for people to reinvest their wealth, for religious people to live frugally, but to reinvest their wealth, and this is going to create wealth that is going to change society. He further argues that this approach, this mindset, this is Weber, so he further argues that this mindset, which he calls the Protestant work ethic, gives birth to modern capitalism. So Weber will argue that Catholics were working for obedience, they were trying to fit into this system, and that it was more of a traditional mindset, and so you were doing what you had to do just in order to be obedient. Luther, Weber is going to argue that when Luther comes along, he's going to release a bit more of the virtue of work, and he's going to release more of an individualistic focus, and a sense of calling to all kinds of work that is done, and really to an entrepreneurial spirit that is going to redirect and reshape society. So, to be clear, Weber was wrong in some of the things that he claimed. But his theory emerges as one of the most important sociological papers of all time, and also one of the more controversial claims in sociology of all time. So, is it true? Well, it's complicated. For starters, discussions about the Protestant work ethic are layered. You've got to, in order to have discussions about the Protestant work ethic, you've got to have discussions, or you've got to have conditions of freedom, and capitalism has to be in play. So by freedom, I'm assuming you know what I mean by freedom, although today many people fundamentally do not understand freedom as it is understood biblically, or even as it's understood by some of the founding leaders of our country, where freedom is sort of the benefit that comes having lived a disciplined life. So many people just associate freedom with the ability to not have to do whatever they don't want to do, as opposed to the benefits that come from discipline. But in this context, freedom means that you have freedom of production, you have freedom of capital, you have freedom of means of production. You're free to control how you live your life so that you can redirect your wealth and your resources in certain ways. Capitalism is a more complicated term to explain. I was looking at all kinds of definitions, some obviously very negative, and the term actually emerges as a negative term. It was initially coined, I think, in the capitalism was initially coined by socialists to just basically talk about greed, and to disparage those people who wanted sort of freedom of control. Adam Smith, when he talks about capitalism, just defines it, this is Wealth of Nations, he defines it more, sort of assumes that it is how a society is going to work when people are free to do what they want, that there will be some divisions of labor, and you'll sort of be free to divide things up, because that will lead to the overall climbing of value in society and wealth of society for everybody. I'll just say that capitalism is this economic system where we've got enough freedom to invest our life and our resources in ways that we think are going to lead to a return on investment. It involves some risk of our resources, but we invest it for ongoing multiplication of value. So back to the question, is the Protestant work ethic real? Is it true? Are Protestants more industrious than atheists? Do they work harder than Buddhists? Do they work harder than Catholics? Did capitalism emerge out of the ideas advanced by Luther as he returns to biblical truth? So it's complicated, in part because people don't even always follow what Weber says is the definition of the Protestant work ethic. So people are often talking about different things. But look, there is some evidence for this, empirical evidence. For starters, there's evidence that Protestants work harder than just about everybody else, tend to work longer hours than Catholics, and tend to work harder when paid the same amount as other people. Some scholars have ignored some of this because they haven't really believed that the data is true, but there is a sense in which it's true. There's also, it's complicated because when you're looking at how hard people are working, or whether or not they are living more simply and they are climbing up because of their quote unquote Protestant beliefs, it's really hard to isolate all the other factors. When people, in general, when people come to faith, I can't say that, but when people come to faith, especially when they come to faith in Christ, there tends to be a new community that is going to surround them and maybe help steer them in healthier directions. There's going to be a greater sense of hope, perhaps, that comes with the idea that God loves them. So whether or not the doctrine is true, Jesus is God, I believe that he is, but whether or not that's true, there are other factors that are happening that might shape whether or not people are more industrious. As a rule, when people come to faith in Christ, they tend to move away from behaviors that we think are less virtuous. They tend to drink less. They tend to gamble less. They tend to cheat less, right? And so all of these things lead to a society that works a little bit better. So what exactly is happening as Christians, and in particular as Protestants, work harder and see an elevation of the collective good? It's hard to pull all the pieces apart. It is worth noting, right at the beginning, I want to be clear, capitalism does not emerge in Northern Europe out of what Luther teaches. And historians never thought this, because historians are pointing out and saying, look, we got capitalism, or we've at least got proto-capitalism, coming in the 11th and 12th centuries in Italy, involving textile mills and other things. We see these ideas. You could argue that you see capitalism, and some will argue that you see capitalism coming out of the monasteries, where there's a division of labor. Now, not all monasteries. Many monasteries, and I'll elevate this point later, but many monasteries, many Catholics were very down on work, down on physical work. They thought it was less spiritual. But there were some. And Benedict, again, we've talked about Benedict, who starts the Benedictine monastic Reformation movement. Benedict says idleness is bad, and he celebrates work. So it's complicated and nuanced. But I read, in preparation for this episode, I read a lot of fascinating studies that are happening, not in the context of church history, but are happening more recently. There was an interesting Freakonomics episode that was looking at the Protestant work ethic and whether or not it's true. And it looked at efforts by, recent efforts, 21st century efforts in the Philippines by Protestant evangelical mission agencies to figure out whether what they're doing is working. And so they would move into isolated tribes, and they ran these random controlled tests where in some tribes they are doing randomly selected. In some tribes, they're doing everything that they do, which starts with they're proclaiming the good news about Christ and the need for Jesus and forgiveness of sins and repentance and faith. They are also providing training in health and in medical efforts. And then they're providing training in sort of life skills, so basic economics, so think basic agriculture and basic entrepreneurship and other things. So they get about 6,000 people involved in this study, and they're controlling very carefully now for which combination of these three pieces, the gospel, health, medical education, and then economics and entrepreneurship, which of these three pieces they give to which groups, and then they're measuring economic output. Because they're working among the poorest of the poor, where a 5% increase means you can feed your kids. The people that they were working with, 32% of the families had lost a child, an infant, because of malnutrition. So they wanted, and it took some, it took a gut check to say, okay, we're not going to, because we want to know what's working, like we're going to control. And there's some tribes where for 6 months we're not going to preach the gospel. We're gonna do one of these other two, or we're going to do two of the other two, and so they do all these studies. Again, this is an economics study. International Care Ministries did it, and they determined that the gospel itself, okay, just the Protestant gospel message, led to a 9% increase in economic output. There was another study that was done in which a historian noted that that the way Protestants and Catholics tended to be organized in Germany came out of something we haven't gotten to yet, but there's going to be a period of time after the Reformation in which areas, as nation states are emerging, areas, Germany had 500 princes. And each prince had their own little, still sort of a feudal system. And if the prince converted to Protestantism, to Lutheranism, then everybody in that feudal area had to convert. If the next prince converts back to Catholicism, everybody had to convert. So what happens is you end up with this big, massive checkerboard around Germany because some people don't want to convert, or they don't want to convert back or whatever. And so you end up with areas that are Protestant and areas that are Catholic. And this happens, 450, 500 years ago. And so now you can study these, and they basically have stayed the same. So you can study the economic output of areas that are largely, they're German speaking, it's the same agriculture. And you can compare Protestant versus Catholic economic output and say, yes, the Protestants tend to be wealthier. Now, it's complicated, but it's sort of also suggests that there's something to this Protestant work ethic. There's other studies. Fascinating study, and I hope to be able to interview him. Robert Woodbury has this piece. So he's a professor. He's an academic studying Protestant missions. And when he was early on, I'm now at the age where I can say, I worked with his father. So I feel some young Robert is now not so young, but he's a very fine scholar. And what he discovered is that when you look at areas where, to use academic terminology, because he's trying to get his research into more secular realms, when you look at conversionary Protestant mission activity in the 19th century, when you look at where Protestant missionaries went in the 19th century with the gospel, and you look at those areas today, they are more democratic, women have greater rights, the people have greater wealth, there is higher education. Now, this is, these are fighting words, right? When most people think of the church as being harsh and ugly and punitive and regressive and all of those things, to say, wow, where Protestant missionaries went in the 19th century, these areas are freer, more democratic, have greater human rights, higher, longer life expectancies. So you see some of this, and again, these are Protestant missionaries bringing a Protestant message and ethos. Adam Grant, he's sort of a popular author right now. He's a Wharton professor, I think the youngest professor to get tenure at Wharton. Forbes listed him as one of the most influential, 40 most influential people under the age of 40. His TED Talks get millions of views. He's an organizational psychologist. And I heard him interviewed, and he goes and speaks about the Protestant work ethic. And he doesn't go into any detail on it. He's obviously very empirically driven. But he says, it's worth noting. Most of the Fortune 500 CEOs happen to be Protestants. There's a book out talks about us being weird, or it looks at people who are weird, and by weird it means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, not as in the party, but as in the system. So it talks about people who are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which is almost certainly you, if you're listening to this. And the author of this, he's a chairman of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. He goes into, I've heard him interviewed, and he's talking about neuroscience and history and theology and all kinds of things get factored into his play. But he notes that, yes, there's something to the Protestant work ethic and the virtue of hard work that Protestants are going to celebrate. All work, again, not just the work of the priest, but all work, the virtue of hard work leads to the ascension of Western civilization vis-a-vis other cultures. So, it's a fascinating topic. It's fascinating and important for our study of, the 100 most significant turning points, because I'm trying eventually for us to understand not just some of our spiritual ancestors and who they did and what they did, and to gain insight and courage and other things from them, but also to understand the world in which we live. So, in 6 high-level points, here's what I think you need to understand. You back up to the Romans and you see that the Roman elite, the Roman educated, the Roman powerful, they despised physical labor. They despised work. Anything that looked like work. It was considered to be beneath them. And you wanted to be, in the Roman world, you wanted to be a consumer. You did not want to be a producer. And so there's even, not just the Romans, but like in ancient Chinese culture, one of the signs of wealth was to grow long fingernails. And they would even have these elaborate silver shields to protect their fingernails, to say, clearly, I don't have to work because I don't see any value in work. So it's not just the Romans. We see this in the Chinese. We see this also with the Greek philosophers. So the philosophers are arguing that there's Plato. Plato's got this idea that, there's the archetype, there's the perfect spiritual world, but the physical world is bad. Aristotle's got this idea of sort of elevating different kinds of ideas and work. They're gonna see the life of the mind as being good, and this thinking is my third point. This thinking is going to get into the church. So we see the influence of Greek thinking in the church early on, right? John will write in his first epistle, not the Gospel of John, but his first letter. It opens with him saying, right, I'm writing to you about the things that I have seen, that I have heard, that I have touched, right? He's talking about the physical world because he's fighting against the Gnosticism that has crept into the church by those who embrace Greek thinking. The Greeks were down on work. So you have this filtering into the church early on. You have this filtering in, especially in the medieval church. You see lots of people saying, if you really love God, you'll become a monk and you won't be a farmer. You won't be a cobbler. You won't work with your hands. You'll simply pray. Prayer is good. Being a farmer is bad. It's second rate. And so, again, there are some exceptions. Benedict will point out some exceptions. There will be some other people who will push back on this in the Catholic Church. But this kind of thinking reaches a high water mark during the medieval ages. So, point number 5, Luther challenges this. And not just Luther, Calvin will push on this as well. And Weber is particularly, as I said, enamored with Calvin. But Luther will come along and first of all, he will say, work is good. God calls us to work. It's not just the great commandment we have to look to, but we have to look to the great commissioning that we get back in Genesis, where we are called to steward the land, and we are called to work for the common good, and we are called to love and care for other people, and this involves work. And feeding people is a good and noble enterprise. He will argue that the priesthood, obviously he had been a priest, but he comes out swinging against the priests at some point, and he'll say that, the handmaiden's work is far more valuable than all the work of the priests and the nuns. So he's going to elevate work. He's going to challenge the sacred secular divide that seems to be growing out of this era that says some things are good and some things are bad, and he's going to say no, everything matters to God, and he is going to push on this. Calvin will also argue that Jesus is not just Lord of the church, but he's Lord of the classroom and the courtroom and the boardroom, and Calvin will work on the sewer system in Geneva, and all of this is considered to be good. Everybody should be working hard. Alongside of this, there's, as people are working hard. So now, as opposed to saying, if I really love God, I'm going to be an ascetic, I'm going to be a monk, I'm going to go to the monastery and not work. Now I'm going to work, I'm going to farm to the glory of God. When you couple that with the idea that I should use my wealth, I should use God's wealth for the benefit of others, and I should be industrious, then you're pouring your profit back into the system that is going to benefit other people. Now, Weber will claim that Calvinists are particularly drivers of the Protestant work ethic because, I don't buy this, by the way. I don't know really anybody that buys this, but this is what Weber will claim, that because of Calvin's doctrine of predestination and the way he's going to push on this, that nervous Calvinists who aren't certain whether they're elect or not will try to justify their election by being industrious and by having wealth, thus shows God's favor. And so you've got all these Calvinists that are working particularly hard, but also living frugal lives. So if you're working hard, but you're spending it all, that's not creating necessarily greater societal wealth. But if you're working hard and reinvesting it in the system for the common good, that is elevating what's going on for everybody. So that's the essence of the Protestant work ethic. A few other things to say, just because I think they're important or interesting. One of the people that clearly that Luther was probably looking at as he's thinking about all of this is his wife. So Luther, he's a priest, so he's single, he's celibate. But when he is then breaking out and challenging rethinking the whole church, he will blow up this idea that priests are called to be celibate. And so the monasteries and the convents, the nunneries are going to be emptied. And Luther will actually help break lots of people out of monasteries and get them released from the vows that they had taken. And I think this happens with his own wife. I think she gets smuggled out of the convent in a pickle barrel, if I remember correctly. But anyway, Katrina, Kitty My Rib is one of the books that is about her. But Katrina von Bora, who had been a nun, becomes Luther's wife. So I think she had initially been born into some money, but she then, takes a vow of poverty as she enters into the nunnery. But she's going to live there, and this is communal living, and so you've got to figure out how you're going to do farming and how you're going to divide labor up to get, the laundry done and all the other stuff that needs to be done. So when she marries Luther, Luther doesn't have any money. I mean, he had been a professor, but he's not getting paid for this, right? So he's a monk. He's taken a vow of poverty. He's in an order in which you essentially are expected to beg for your income. And so she's got to figure out how they're gonna live. Now, eventually a prince is going to give them access to one of the monasteries that gets emptied. And Luther is going to start to fill up this monastery with students that are studying for the ministry, and so there'll be, it's not unusual for him to have lots of people at dinner, and this will lead to the table talks. Maybe you've heard this. R.C. Sproul has got a daily devotion out that's called Table Talk. Table Talk comes from what Luther did, and lots of people would write down all the things that he was teaching at dinner. But she's got to come up with ways to feed 20 or 30 people. And so she's going to be very industrious. She's going to be buying land. She's going to be hiring people to cook meals. She's going to be charging room and board. She's going to, because the water was a problem, and there wasn't enough milk to drink, everybody's drinking beer. So there's Luther beer, right? She's gonna have her own little distillery going. And she, by the time, I think by 1542, the Luthers will own more land in Wittenberg than anyone else, right? So he's looking at his own wife, who is being entrepreneurial and figuring out how to make things work. And so that's sort of the secret sauce there that we'll see spreading to others. I think it's important to note, I've talked about the fact that Protestants tend to work harder than Buddhists and Catholics and others. In some settings, those would be fighting words. So let me just note, Protestants tend to have more problems with workaholism, which is really sort of a lack of the kind of spiritual formation and sanctification that we ought to have. It's having your identity in work as opposed to your identity in Christ. And so working too hard, maybe because of greed, maybe because of insecurity. But it's worth noting. Today, we have a lot of challenges with workaholism. Today, the rich, right, who often have got, now, in previous generations and in other cultures, if you're rich, you tend not to work harder than other people. Today, the rich tend to work longer hours than anyone else. And they tend to work harder than anyone else. And they tend to put themselves under more stress because of their work than other people. Also, Protestants tend to have, there's some socioeconomic measurements that are not favorable to Protestants. There tends to be more suicide in Protestantism than in Catholicism. So just want to be out there with that. And then I'll also just note that one of the things that gets a little confusing as you try to study the Protestant work ethic in light of modern realities is that at the time Luther is sort of elevating the life of the farmer or the cobbler or whatever, you tended to have a job for life. If your father was a farmer, you were a father. Or if your mother was a seamstress, you were a seamstress. If your dad, repaired shoes, then that's what you did. And everybody sort of stayed in their lane, and you did that for your entire life. And so he's elevating and suggesting that you have a call to be a farmer. You have a call to be a cobbler. And today, people tend to change professions all the time. So what we see people talking more about is how we're gifted, what's our spiritual gift mix, and how do those things play out. So it's a complicated topic. I, again, decided to take it up because I think it has big long-term effects as it relates to today's culture. I want to just start to emphasize the fact that you've got these ideas that lead to different kinds of cultures, and that over the course of generations, these have profound impact as they spread. So it's complicated, but I think there's something to this idea, the virtue of hard work that we see coming out of the Christian faith in general, perhaps Protestantism in particular. In the next episode, we're going to look at the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, because after the Reformation happens, especially as we get into Trent, it's obvious that there isn't going to be a reconciliation, that lots of people are following Luther or following Calvin, Zwingli, others. The Catholic Church doesn't stay static, right? It is going to address a number of the issues that Luther was going after. So we'll pick that up next time. See you then.